altar building. That's the title of my message. And we'll be looking into Joshua chapter 22. And we're not going to read through that right now, but we will be looking at parts of it as we go through the message this morning. How many make New Year's resolutions? Anybody? Nobody. What kind of people are you anyway? Well, I don't either, so. How many have made resolutions in the past? How many have kept those revolutions for more than a week? Okay, a couple. More than a year? All our hands are down. You know, we are, and I prayed about this, America is celebrating our 250th birthday this coming year. January 4th, 2026 will be 250 years that our nation has been a nation. And they're doing a lot of things in this coming year. Our president has some things that he's going to announce and do and encourage all of us to do. And, you know, it's a milestone. You know, most great nations that have ruled the world usually last about 200 years. If you go back in history and study history, most of the world powers, world dominion powers, lasted for about 200 years. I'm hoping that America can keep looking at their roots and you know, the reasons that we were founded and you know, look at our Constitution and you know, the Bill of Rights and all those, and remember that those are what we were founded on, and Lord, and that we need to keep those in our minds and continue to be the great nation that God has allowed us to be. You know, it's like in the Bible, people built altars. Back, well, we don't know how many years, but Noah, who floated through the great worldwide flood, Noah and his family and all the animals that God brought to the ark. Noah was in the ark for, I think it was close to a year, or somewhere right around there. But he finally came out. God opened the door, and it was dry land. The very first thing that Noah did, he built an altar. He built an altar and sacrificed one of the clean animals that he had brought with him. He sacrificed that animal on the altar that he had built. Abraham, remember Abraham? Father Abraham. Well, God told Abraham, Abraham, I want you to take your son, Isaac, your only son, and I want you to go up on a mountain that I'm going to show you, and I want you to sacrifice your son up there on, actually it was Mount Moriah. Some people think it was where the temple was built. So he got Isaac and piled some wood on Isaac and took some donkeys with him and a couple servants, and they went to where God told them to go, and they left everything except the wood, and Isaac carried the wood up on Mount Moriah, and Abraham built an altar. He took stones that were there and built this altar, and Isaac said, you know, Dad, we've got an altar and we've got wood to burn, but we don't have a sacrifice. What did Abraham say? He said, God will provide a sacrifice. And God provided a sacrifice. Abraham was ready to plunge that knife into Isaac's chest, and God said to Abraham, hold your hand, don't do it. And Isaac got off of the altar, and Abraham looked, and here was a ram, actually, caught in a bush. And Abraham went and got that lamb, or that ram, and laid it on the altar and killed it. But Abraham built an altar. Remember Jacob? Jacob, one of Isaac's sons. Jacob was heading for his mother's hometown in Ur of the Chaldees, someplace in what today would be Iraq. And he was heading there, and got to be evening, and so he thought, well, I'm gonna sleep the night, get up and be on my way in the morning again. And so he got up and realized and decided he was going to build an altar. He built an altar. And then when he came back, he stopped at the same place and built and continued, sacrificed on that altar, and and the name of that place was Bethel. But Isaac had seen this dream. Jacob had seen this dream during the night, and he wanted to remember, you know, what this dream was about, and so he wanted to do something that would remind him about this dream that he had of, you know, the ladder going up into heaven and the angels and all of that. And so he built an altar to remember that. Well, that's what we want to learn about today a little bit. It's time to put a map up on the screen. There we go. Everybody likes history, right? Sure we do. We're going to have a little history lesson this morning about Joshua and the children of Israel. Now, we remember that the children of Israel were in Egypt, and they became slaves in Egypt. Now, on this map, it doesn't show Egypt, but Egypt is down farther on the map, and it's there even though we don't see it. But they were there in Egypt for about 400 years. And God talked to Moses and said, Moses, I want you to lead my people, Israel, to the promised land. And this is the promised land. And Moses was a little afraid at first. He said, well, I can't talk. How am I supposed to tell Pharaoh that that I'm supposed to take my people to sacrifice? And God said, well, your brother Aaron can be your mouthpiece. And so Moses went back to Egypt and led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they wandered around in the wilderness, which is kind of between Egypt and the Promised Land. And you remember the story that Moses sent 12 spies into the land? 10 of them came back with a bad report and said, "Oh, we can't go in there. There's giants there. We cannot do that. We'll get killed. We just can't do it. There's giants there." But Joshua and Caleb came back, and there was 12, one from each tribe. Joshua and Caleb came back and said, "Let's go. We can do it." But they followed the advice of the 10, and so God said, "Moses, I'm gonna have you wander around in this wilderness area for, well, it was 40 years. It was until the next generation came along. All of those that were 20 years old and older died during that 40-year sojourn in the wilderness. Moses died, and so Joshua took over. And they came to the Promised Land. And you'll notice that on the map, there's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, and there's a river running through that, up and down that country, and that divided the country. And when they were wandering around in the wilderness, there was 2.5 tribes that decided they wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan River because it was a good land for raising their sheep and goats. And so when Joshua went into the Promised Land, the army went with them from Reuben and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh. Their army went in and they helped conquer the land. And then they were heading back. They were heading back to the land that was promised to them. And I'd like to read part of this in Joshua 22. The 2.5 tribes were heading back to their part of the Promised Land that was on the eastern side of Jordan. Joshua gave a charge to these 2.5 tribes. Joshua chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, you have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. And you have obeyed in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your brothers, but have carried out the mission the Lord our God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given your brothers rest, as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan River. But be careful," Joshua said, "but be careful to keep the commandments of the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to obey his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. And so they said, okay, that's what we're going to do. And they before they crossed the Jordan, they said, we need something here that will signify that we are part of this great nation. Something that will tell the rest of the nation that is going into their land on the west side of the Jordan, something that will cause them to remember that even though there's this river that divides us, something that will cause them to remember that we are part of them. And so they said, you know what we need to do? We need to build an altar. And so they built an altar. Look at verse 10 in chapter 22. And when they came to Gililoth, near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. So here they are, they build this great altar, and then the rest of Israel hears about this after it's been done, after the, where'd my map go? Oh, thank you. After they went into their part of the land, you know, the people heard that these 2.5 tribes had built this altar. And they were commanded never to build an altar and sacrifice on it other than at the tabernacle at that time. They had the great bronze altar at the tabernacle, and that's where they were to sacrifice. And the Israelites thought, what, you know, Joshua just told them not to build an altar, not to forsake the Lord. And here they are building an altar. We need to go to war and we need to teach them a lesson. That's what they thought. And somebody said, well, let's find out first what's going on. And so they chose Phinehas, the son of the priest, and they chose 10 other men, one from each tribe. And verse 13 says this: So the Israelites sent Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, to the land of Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and a half-tribe of Manasseh. With them they sent 10 of the chief men, one for each of the other tribes of Israel. And so they wanted to find out what was going on. And they caught up to them, and they went into that part of Israel, and they got to the people there, and they said, "What have you done? Don't you remember? Don't you remember what happened when Balaam prophesied and told us to intermarry with these idolaters?" He said, "Don't you remember that 24,000 of our people were killed because of that?" And don't you remember Achan? You know, the children of Israel that crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, and they marched around Jericho, you know, once every day for a week, and on the seventh day they marched around it 7 times, and the walls fell down. And they went in and conquered it. And the Israelites said, "Don't you remember Achan?" Achan, they were commanded not to take anything. And Achan took a wedge of gold and a costly garment from these people of Jericho. And he took them to his tent, and he hid them in the ground. And the children of Israel, don't you remember what happened? How the next day we went against Ai, that great city, and God caused us to be defeated. And God said, you know, what happened here? And Joshua prayed and said, Lord, what's going on? Why did we lose the battle when you said we were supposed to have a great victory? God told Joshua, well, there's sin. There's sin in the camp. And they found out who it was, and Achan and his whole family were stoned to death because of the sin of Achan. And Israel lost the battle with Ai. But when they took care of that sin, they went against Ai again, and they had went against Ai, and they had a great victory. And the children of Israel said, don't you remember what happened? Well, the 2.5 tribes said, well, yeah, we remember all that, but, you know, this altar that we built is not something that we are going to worship at. We built this altar as a memorial. Look at verses 21 to 29. I want to read this section. 21 to 29. Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel, the mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord. He knows, and let Israel know if this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord. Do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord, to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do we have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord, so your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar. But not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and fellowship offerings. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no share in the Lord. And we said, if they ever say this to us or to our descendants, we will answer, look at the replica of the Lord's altar, which our fathers built, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord and turn away from him today by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifices, other than the altar of the Lord, our God, that stands before his tabernacle. And when Phinehas the priest heard that, he thought it was a good idea. Look at let's go on reading at verse 31. Well, I'll start in verse 30. When Phinehas the priest, the leaders of the community, the heads of the clans of the Israelites heard what Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had to say, they were pleased. Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, and to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is with us, because you have not acted unfaithfully toward the Lord in this manner. Now you have rescued the Israelites from the Lord's hand. And then Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, and the leaders returned to Canaan from their meeting with the Reubenites, Gadites in Gilead, and reported to the Israelites. They were glad to hear the report and praise God, and they talked no more about going to war against them to devastate the country where the Reubenites and Gadites lived. And the Reubenites and Gadites gave the altar this name, a witness between us that the Lord is God. So we have the Israelites all together, and they have this witness, this altar as a witness between them. You know, we need to be making altars in our lives, altars to God, altars to remember. You know, once a month we do the Lord's Supper. Why do we do that? Well, what did Jesus say at the Last Supper? He said, do this to remember me, to remember what this stands for. Stands for my body, stands for my blood. Remember that. Paul, 1 Corinthians, he said, I received this from the Lord. Remember Paul, while the disciples were with Jesus for 3 years, Paul was in the wilderness, in the desert with Jesus for 3 years. And he told the Corinthians, he said, I received of the Lord this command about the Lord's Supper. And he said, do this, and we read that often in 1 Corinthians 11. Do this in remembrance of me. And so we have this Lord's Supper as a remembrance. You know, there's a verse in 2 Timothy, chapter 4 and verse 1. It says, Paul is talking to Timothy, and he says, Timothy, I charge you, preach the word. Preach the word. You know, I have looked at those verses often, and I have taken those verses to mean me. Paul, Jesus, and God speaking to me. Preach a word. That's what I've tried to do my whole life. Well, not my whole life, but, since I was in high school. That's been my goal, to preach the word. But it says there, Timothy, preach the word, be it in season or out of season. You know, it may be an appropriate time, like this morning. Here I am. This is an appropriate time. This is in season that I should be up here talking to you, preaching. Because the pastor's gone, and this is part of what God has called me to do, to preach the word in season. But not only in season, but out of season. When it's not convenient. When you know, I get a call at 8 o'clock Saturday night and say, well, the pastor's sick, he's not going to, you know, I got to relate this. A couple of years ago, when I was doing interim work here, there was a Sunday, and I was sick. I mean, I was really sick. So what did I do? I called Paul. He said, we'll work it out. And he did. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for being so kind. But that's, you know, that's what out of season means. And, you know, and that's happened to me sometimes too. Somebody has said, well, we need a preacher tomorrow. And I said, I'm available. In season and out of season. But Paul wrote to Timothy, Paul wrote to Timothy, that's right. Timothy chapter 1, 2 Timothy. And Paul said, Timothy, remember to do what you're called to do. Remember. Read those verses sometime. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6 and part of that. Another place where we're commanded to remember is 2 Peter. 2 Peter. He says over and over again, remember these things. You know, you read 2 Peter chapter 1 and he says remember 3 times in that first chapter. Remember. You know, we should remember what the Lord has done for us. And you know, I think there are some great things that God does for us that we need to remember. And the first thing is salvation. You know, Jesus came to die on the cross. We need to remember that. We need to remember when we got saved, if we can. You know, if you can remember that date, mark it down. Don't forget it. Make that an altar that you can go back to and say, this is the day. You know, I was talking to my daughter, not this past week, but a couple years ago when we were up there, and I asked her, I said, do you remember when you got saved? I said, you were only 3 years old. She said, yeah, I remember. So remember when you got saved. Are you baptized? If you're saved, you should be baptized. You know, in the Bible, in the New Testament, when they got saved, they got baptized almost right away. That was part of the New Testament church. They baptized them just about immediately after they were saved. And that's another time that we should remember. We should mark it down and make that an altar in our life that we can go back to and we can remember, just like the children of Israel did 3,000 years ago. They built an altar to remember that they were all part of one country, one nation, one people. Have you surrendered your life to Jesus? You know, we sang, I surrender all. Have you done that? That's part of what we need to do. We know Romans 12, 1 and 2, and I want to read that so I get it right. And I have memorized it, but I've memorized the King James, and this is the NIV. And there's something here I want to share because I just noticed it this morning when I was rereading these verses. Romans 12, 1 and 2, it says, Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is what it just popped out right at me. It says, then, after you do these things, after you renew yourself, after you renew your mind, Paul says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now, maybe God will do that without going through the first part of that, but that, that just stuck out to me this morning. After you do these, after you don't conform anymore to the world, and after you reform your mind, then you'll be able to know what God's will is for your life. Have you surrendered to Jesus? God has a plan for every one of us. Doesn't matter who we are. If you're a Christian, God has a plan for your life. It's up to us to be praying and searching and transforming our mind about certain things, and then let the Lord lead us and direct us. Have you surrendered your all to Jesus? We need to build that altar in our life. Say, this is the date, this is the time that I've surrendered to Jesus. How many altars have you got in your life that you can look back on and say, this is when I got saved. This is when I was baptized. This is when I surrendered to Jesus. Building altars. It's a great thing. We need to be building altars in our lives for being in church, being good stewards, all those things that the Bible talks about that as Christians we're supposed to do and be. Building altars. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you that you died on the cross to save us. Lord, I pray that if there might be somebody here today that has never really been saved, that you would speak to them and that they would come to know you today and be able to look back on January or December 28th, 2025 and say, that's the day that I got saved. But Lord, help us to be building altars in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.